Hi, I'm Joe Lindsley, an American in Ukraine. This is our Land of the Free podcast with Ukrainska Pravda, Ukrainian Truth, and our team from Ukrainian Freedom News. And I have been in Ukraine every moment since the pandemic, and now every moment of Russia's full-scale invasion. And as I've traveled this country in the wartime, I've met the most extraordinary voices, both Ukrainians and foreigners alike, working for freedom. And I realized that if more people in the West and in America could hear the voices in English of those who are standing up against this evil force of tyranny coming from Moscow, it would really, I think, awaken a sense of belief in the human spirit and democracy throughout the world. And so this is our podcast, Land of the Free, UkrainianFreedomNews.com. You can support our work to help guys at the front lines, and Ukrainska Pravda, legendary Ukrainian independent media. For our guest today, we have my great friend Taras Bick. Taras is a civil society guy. He was part of the Maidan revolution in 2014. He's got great stories from those days when Ukraine changed its destiny away from Russian totalitarianism toward freedom. And Taras also, he's a political strategist. He's worked at the micro level with fighting corruption throughout Ukraine in different cities. He's with the firm called Wooden Horse Strategies, and he has an NGO, Agency for Recovery and Development. And I think Taras also, he's a great thinker about what it means, what Ukrainian democracy means. But he's also got a very interesting project, which to some people sounds impossible, working on the collapse of the Russian Federation. And so here is my conversation in our podcast, Land of the Free, with great Ukrainian Taras Bick.
This is the land of the free. Stories of life and liberty in a time of war.
Taras, you're from Lviv in the West. Because it's a holiday here, even though this will be aired much later, we have both have vyshyvanka, the traditional Ukrainian embroidered garments for the holiday. I just arrived from Kharkiv this morning by train. Taras, what are you doing here in Kyiv now?
These days in Kyiv are doing the same stuff as usually, trying to return to normal life, like working conditions, communicating with my friends on the front lines, asking them what they need, trying to help them with everything they need, and working on the recovery and development of Ukraine, which is like another big direction of our activities here.
Well, as I see you today, I mean, I think it's hard to remember where I saw you last, and this is the nature of life in the war in Ukraine. But you know, it's a huge country, the largest country in Europe, and you have everyone traveling to and fro throughout the country. Sometimes at a gas station, I'll run into a gas station in Donbass. I'll run into people I haven't seen since Lviv or somewhere else, and it's a sign of how everyone is moving actively, working for victory. So was it last fall? We had that wartime road trip to Odessa and Mykolaiv, and where on that trip I learned a lot about your work with for years you've been working against corruption in Ukraine, and especially at the local level, and sort of strengthening local governance, because for so long, of course, Ukraine was stuck in the Soviet model where everything was centralized, and that's been a big project since the Maidan revolution, since 2014, to give a renaissance of locally controlled politics, which also removes the corruption by taking the money away from one central location. And as we start this podcast, a goal as an American, I realize so many of the Americans who love freedom, especially the people that have left California to go to Austin, Texas, if they knew the real story of Ukraine, of how fiercely free it is, of how not only how people are working for victory now, but how for years people have been working to make government work for the people, to make government of the people. I know Americans would be inspired by this, and that's why we're doing this program. And I've brought so many Americans here to Ukraine, and when they talk with you and so many others, they're inspired. And so if we can share these brilliant Ukrainian voices with America in particular, to show that this is the capital of freedom here on this Independence Day. And so there's so much we can talk about, and as we've been to, whether talking in bars or on road trips, always exchanging many stories. Here it is, August 24th today, Ukrainian Independence Day. You were in the Maidan, not far away from here, in Kyiv, in 2014. What is the story from your perspective of the Maidan revolution? Because I think that gets missed a lot in the stories. We hear about Ukraine, of course, every single day. What happened in 2013, 2014 with the Maidan revolution?
So first of all, thank you for everything you're doing for making voice of Ukrainians heard, especially in the United States of America. Going back to 2013, I would say that this was basically beginning of the long-term revolution, which turned later into war, because to some extent it was a kind of anti-Russian event. Ukraine was on the crossroads, so we were deciding either we are going westwards to become a real European NATO country, or we are going to become another once again, basically not to become, but remain under slavery of Russia. And this is the clash of civilizations. We then chose our path towards Europe, going westwards. It costed us lives. It was something really hard to imagine. Well, I mean, before the Revolution of Dignity, just imagine you are walking in the center of capital city of European country in the 21st century, and several months later you see people shot dead there by their own police, which was obviously controlled not so much by Ukraine, but mainly by Russia. But still, this is what was happening. This was like first shock, and then the revolution basically immediately turned into war, because when Russia, I'm sure about it, what I'm telling, this is Russia, it's not only Yanukovych regime, it was fully controlled by Moscow. When Russia failed to get rid of Maidan, to get rid of protesters on Maidan, then it started immediately war on the Crimea, on the Donbass, and that's how it involved in full-scale invasion in 2019. So this is like a very long path to our freedom. But for all this period, starting from 2013, the Ukrainian people have demonstrated that freedom is much more important for us than anything else. And I think the entire world has seen us today.
You know, I think of the great phrase in American political history of "give me liberty or give me death," and that's you know, it's true here, and we see this in the most difficult sense. I want to talk about your personal experience in the Maidan, but before that, and by the way, I mean, Taras, you work now. You have an NGO in the wartime Agency for Recovery and Development. You've also worked as a political consultant, Wooden Horse Strategies, with many Americans and others, and you've helped get sort of this Maidan generation elected, especially at the local level. We can talk about that, but I want, you know, when so many Americans, unfortunately, hear about Maidan, you know, in the American imagination of freedom-loving Americans, the Maidan Revolution was created by one woman. She was the mastermind in the U.S. State Department, Victoria Nuland. Even as I was on the train today, I was watching yet another clip from my old colleague Tucker Carlson, claiming that, you know, Ms. Nuland was somehow orchestrated this revolution. What is your response to that? That the Maidan, the Revolution of Dignity, as it's called, was created by the State Department, specifically by Victoria Nuland?
I would just say that Victoria Nuland was a guest who was warmly welcomed on Maidan, just like many other guests who were coming to support us. Well, obviously, I mean, I was there from the very beginning, just like millions of other Ukrainians. Actually, on the day of when Maidan started, I was in Ivano-Frankivsk, in Western Ukrainian city.
How old were you at this point?
So it was 2013. I was 30 years old. And I mean, when we went to Maidan in Ivano-Frankivsk the first night, I remember those are just my friends. Well, obviously, you can hardly imagine, I don't know, like U.S. State Department representative present in Ivano-Frankivsk.
Because this is in Western Ukraine,
yes.
many hours away from Kyiv.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there were, on the first night of the revolution, even in Ivano-Frankivsk, which is like 600 kilometers from Kyiv, there were attempts to set tents in the center of the city to start like local Maidan. And this is something that was happening all over Ukraine. So this is something you cannot like organize from above. This was real, genuine grassroots movement, bottom-up approach. And that's how people went to Maidan in Kyiv, in Ivano-Frankivsk, in all over Ukraine, in southern Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, everywhere. And of course, Kyiv has become like center of the protest because people from all over Ukraine were coming to Maidan. And I mean, this is something you cannot, even if you wanted, you cannot organize logistically. This is a million people coming to Maidan. It's not possible to organize. So this is basically my response. But yes, Victoria Nuland, just like many other guests, Western friends, other friends, were coming to Maidan to see us, and they were warmly welcome.
Now we should mention the word Maidan is in Ukrainian, but it comes from a Persian word, meaning Turkish word, yeah, and meaning public square, meaning sort of the central square of the city, and that has come to mean in Ukraine, because you had previous Maidans, you had one in 2004, for example, the Orange Revolution, but it's come to mean when the people, it's like, to me, it's a fourth branch of government. It's really the final check and balance. It's when the people take to the square and demand that their rights be heard, that their voices be heard, and demand their freedoms. And it really is, we talk about the public square in America, but it exists in a real way. It's an actual place. I mean, in cities like Ivano-Frankivsk and Lviv and Kyiv, there's actually a Maidan where people can gather. So it's in the geographic structure of the cities. So in 2013, it was October 2013.
Late November.
Late November. What was the thing that got you to go to, you as one Ukrainian who was well connected politically, paying attention politically and working in that field, but what got you to say, I need to go to the Maidan tonight in the city of Ivano-Frankivsk?
The funny thing that everything started from the decision by the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine to cancel one of the bylaws, basically. It was not a really important law. It was not some strategic document, but this bylaw was deciding if we are continuing negotiations on joining the association agreement with the European Union or not. But everyone had realized if we are canceling this small, which seemed to be quite an important document, everyone realized that we are switching eastwards. And basically this was part of the bigger picture when Yanukovych was basically communicating with Moscow much more than with Brussels, and it was becoming clear that the government is refusing from the European integration path and is becoming closer and closer to the West. And that's when we went to first in Ivano-Frankivsk, then on my way to Kyiv I stopped in Lviv, I saw Maidan there, then we came to Kyiv, and this is when really big Maidan had begun. But still, first it was not that big. I remember there were actually two Maidans in Kyiv, so one was organized by civil society organizations and another one by political parties, because civil society would not accept any flags of political parties present on their Maidan. Political parties still wanted to demonstrate their affiliation with the parties, and they were divided. One was on Maidan Square, and the other was on European Square.
And where was Victoria Nuland's Maidan?
And Victoria Nuland came much later, after we basically united Maidans, and this unity of Maidans came after the night on, I think, December 1st, because, the Maidan was absolutely peaceful. Yes, I mean, some roads were blocked, but there were no aggressive attacks, nothing, I would say, illegal. But on the night on December 1st, as far as I remember, there was this attack on students. It was absolutely brutal, absolutely, authoritarian style attack. So this was what happening. And this basically pushed for another wave of people coming together. In the next several days, we had so-called March of Millions, when just people from all over Ukraine, there are different calculations, but many of them say that up to 1 million were present on Maidan, not only on Maidan, but all around Kyiv. And this was not only about refusal from European integration, this was a protest against measures taken by the government when innocent students were beaten in the center of the capital city. So this is where many people came, many people stayed, and this is when we started, just building barricades on that night. More and more people were coming. We were setting tents and realized, so this is much more about foreign policy. It's about not allowing Ukraine to turn into an authoritarian state, because this is something that would not be acceptable by us.
And was this authoritarianism, was it creeping in, or was it still sort of the same you'd had from the Soviet times, or did it seem like it was getting worse? Had there been a period of recovery since the 2004 Orange Revolution?
Yes, absolutely. In 2004, we had really high expectations because, it was actually it was second Maidan. The first was in 1991, when once again students started it as well as on Maidan. And then in 2004, we had another Maidan, and after victory of this Maidan, when Yushchenko was elected as president, everyone hoped that democracy is here, is done. But the problem is that everyone took it for granted. And, instead of starting doing something themselves, people had too much expectations from President Yushchenko, from government, and they said, okay, now everything is ready, we have democracy, everything will be done. But obviously it doesn't work this way, because, you have to work hard. Turns out you have to work hard to keep democracy, to keep safety, to keep security. And that's how Yanukovych was elected as president. And several years later, even though, I was shocked when Yanukovych was elected, elected, because for me it was obvious way to disaster, which ultimately happened several years later. So we had this, attempt of having freedom for several years, but somehow we lost it, and we lost it actually in free and fair elections. Those were free and fair elections which brought Yanukovych to power. So, and after the third actually Maidan, everyone realized, okay, that's freedom is not given for granted. We have to do something to keep it. We have to work hard to fight corruption, to work hard to strengthen good governance, and so on and so on. So this, I would say, two major differences between the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity. After the Revolution of Dignity, the role of civil society, the role of local self-governance was much stronger. People realized that they had to do something themselves to keep the freedom, to keep the democracy.
I want to talk a bit about what it was, some of the moments during those days, camped out in the streets in Kyiv during the revolution. But first, you could say, and here we have, I think I'm still on Kharkiv alarm system, so it's not for Kyiv, because I've been there the past week. But it was more or less February 24th, 2014, that the Yanukovych, interesting date, by the way, that the Yanukovych regime fled to Moscow. And when everyone left, you went home after that from the streets of Kyiv after many people had been there for months, and it was a little society that was created there. What did people just go home and rest, or did they go home with a new sense of, okay, we need to do X, Y, and Z to make this revolution work? Were there any mechanisms that helped keep that spirit alive?
Well, talking about me personally, I remember I went home sleeping because I was on the night of those actually on the morning of mass shootings, but I was just standing on the other side of Maidan, which basically saved me from bullets. I was so emotionally and psychologically tired, and besides, physically, because we were building barricades all night. We were breathing with all those smoke ashes. So I came home just all black because of the smoke. So we just needed some rest. But I remember then when we came home, we realized the scale of the tragedies, because I thought the dead bodies, basically we were cleaning the street for ambulances to come over to take the bodies. We saw them while they were being brought from the Institutska street, but we were busy doing something. And then when we came home and we saw this funerals of those people, and this is when I started basically crying, because I realized how many people died when fighting for this. Talking about long-term prospects, it was still before the end of the Revolution of Dignity when people started gathering together, thinking about what to do next. It was becoming quite clear that Yanukovych is going to lose Maidan, so the only question was how he is losing the Maidan. And then there were groups of people coming together. One of them, the most famous of them, was a so-called reanimation package of reforms. So basically a group of civil society activists who were coming together to think about what state policies have to be next, and so on and so on. And many of them actually became later, they joined cabinet of ministers, parliament, and so on and so on. So those were civil society groups who got united to elaborate new policies, elaborate new strategies for the country. And on the other side, we did not have time to relax, because basically Putin started war in Crimea, in Donbass, almost on the same day Yanukovych fled Maidan. So Ukrainians got united. Many of them as volunteers went to fight, because Yanukovych basically destroyed the Ukrainian army. We did not have strong enough Ukrainian army to defend Ukraine. That's why we lost Crimea and Donbass so easily. But there were still thousands of Ukrainian men volunteering to go to fight. And they played a role that Russia did not go any farther back in 2014.
Because actually in 2014, Kharkiv, for maybe 24 hours, was sort of in Russian hands. The Russians tried to take Odessa. I think we forget this now, but this is why when I was here in Ukraine, throughout the pandemic and then in the weeks leading up to the full-scale invasion, I knew with complete confidence that there's no way Ukraine was going to fall in 3 days, because I'd seen I'd heard the history, met people who'd been there in Kharkiv, 30 miles from Russia, in 2014, when the mayor almost sort of was almost bribed by Russia and then changed his mind, but how the regular citizens defended their city, and this was as a result of the Maidan Revolution. It was like, with the Euromaidan, with Revolution of Dignity, Putin and maybe many others, it seems, lost their control to plunder from Ukraine. Do you think, had there been no Maidan in 2014, would there be any kind of war right now, as we are seeing?
I mean, if Maidan lost back in 2014, or if there were no Maidan, Yanukovych would simply give up Ukraine to Russia, and we would have been fully controlled by Russia. Ukraine would be another Belarus today. And just imagine the consequences in this case for Europe, for example. Imagine that it was not only Belarus that is fully controlled by Russia, but Ukraine, with its, well, turns out quite strong army. And imagine Russia, in addition to Russian army, has Belarusian army, Ukrainian army, and it would be able to invade NATO anytime in this case. So this, basically, I would say Maidan has saved not only Ukraine, but Maidan has saved Europe as well.
Wow, because we don't think about what things be like had that movement not happened, and had those students had the courage to face the bullets of the. One thing that's amazing to me, you had the secret police, the breakup, and because of Maidan, the secret police no longer exist. And I think when I tell this to Americans, because we the Americans who talk about freedom, the sound of freedom, and everything so much, you see that there's a lot of frustration in America now with Washington, and with prosecutors run amok and all kinds of things like that. Well, but in Ukraine, there was a very brutal, very powerful secret police, and because of your revolution, they're gone. They were disbanded. And in fact, I think you were one of the first people that told me this, but in the first few weeks after the Maidan revolution, there was very little structure. I mean, so including in the military, but there was very little structure in Ukraine. And is it true that there were no police for several weeks? What was that situation?
Well, physically, yes. In some places, police, I would say, was just disoriented. So formally they were present. In some places they just fled. And actually, going back to Maidan, we have a joke that Maidan was the first successful Ukrainian state, because when people were coming to the central square, we had everything that state needs. Basically, we had a kind of border control. There was people standing on the entrances to Maidan just to to control that we do not have like alcoholics, drug addicts. Nobody is bringing any weapon. There was a kind of border control, we would say. If somebody got hurt, immediately there was sufficient assistance. So we had a good healthcare system on Maidan. It was extremely clean, so everyone was cleaning. So our so-called utility services on Maidan were working perfectly. So we had this joke about Maidan being a first successful Ukrainian state, and this actually is example of strong abilities of self-organization of Ukrainians. Just when we got together, we have divided activities, what we have to do. Those people are taking care of the border of Maidan. These are taking care of healthcare. This is cleaning streets, and so on and so on. And the same happened after Maidan, when our authorities were disorganized, in many cases disappeared, including police. Quite often those were people, because obviously there were some let's say criminal people who were trying to use the situation. They were basically entering police headquarters to set on fire all the documents which they were afraid of. And that's why many people who were basically standing on Maidan, they took care of those administrative premises, police premises, to take control until normal police, until normal authorities returned to power. So this is what was happening actually.
When we look at, say, protest movements in France and in the United States, and I think they tend to get very chaotic. There's a lot of things burnt down, and it can be quite dangerous. Where does this and I've seen this self-organizing ability in the wartime, especially those first weeks of the full-scale invasion. Is this embedded in Ukrainian DNA? Is it because you had to find ways to survive through centuries of totalitarianism? Where does this self-organizing ability or skill come from? How was it developed?
Good question. I think it comes back from 13th century when we had first invasion in Kiev and Rus by Mongolian Tatars from the east, and surprise, surprise, until today we have more invasions from the east. So Ukrainians had to fight for their freedom for centuries, with different enemies from different from west, from south, from east. But of course, from east we have until today. I think this legacy is connected to this Mongolian Tatar horde that existed in the 13th century. That is, I see, a direct line and direct attempts basically to exterminate our people. You should remember about history of Cossacks, Ukrainian freedom-loving people who were just going to steppes, to defend themselves. We remember history's tragedies of Holodomor, the genocide organized by the Soviet Union in the 20th centuries, where basically it tried to kill the mainly people in villages who were at that time the basis of the Ukrainian nation. So it's for centuries we had this story of survival, of fighting for freedom, and which basically helped us today. And today we realize that if we give up, we'll be exterminated. It's that simple.
Is it fair to, if we give up, we'll be exterminated? That's the thing to remember. And is this a fair characterization? You have the term Decapoli, the wild fields, and the Cossacks and everyone sort of in these wild fields and in the wild mountains were people who they never wanted to be controlled. There wasn't sort of, you had empires from the east and the west trying to control these lands, trying to subdue them, but there were people who wanted to sort of, there's a tradition, you could say, like Nestor Makhno, the Ukrainian anarchist, so-called. But I don't know if it was quite anarchy. It was families and communities sort of living in freedom together. And, I studied a lot of political and constitutional theory under some of the most brilliant political theorists in the world. And not until I came here to Ukraine had I ever heard that there was a constitution well before our American Constitution, 1711, Philip Orlik, Cossack Constitution, codified in what is now Zaporizhia, I think, or around Nikopol. And so they weren't just wild people running around in the fields. They actually were creating structures to try to protect that freedom. But we know so little of that legacy. Why do you think why do you think no one pays attention to that? Was that Constitution a big deal in 1711? It had separation of powers, and when the time when no one else did. And I would always say that the founding fathers of America were the first in modern times to create such a document. What happened with that constitution when that experiment of the Cossacks?
I would just look at on this picture much broader. Why the West doesn't know about this constitution and other attempts of Ukrainians to establish democracy? It's very simple, because you have never had Ukrainian studies. Because everything about Ukraine was studied at the departments of Russian studies, of course. And Russia has played just huge role, just try to to get rid of all mentions of Ukraine, just trying, basically just like they stole the name of our country, Rus. They were trying to steal everything else, and including all our inventions, including all our achievements, and so on and so on. And Russia has put enormous efforts in their information or disinformation policies to propagate basically establishment to support those so-called Russian studies, within which everything Ukrainian or any other countries within the Russian Empire was simply ignored. So I think this is the major reason why the West doesn't know much about Ukraine, Constitution of Philip Orlik, and many other achievements of Ukraine.
Well, there are other. So as an Irish American with deep connections to my family homeland in the west coast of Ireland, where they fought for freedom for centuries, and whenever I go back to those lands, I can see the monuments. I recall the history where for 300 years. The British, forbade us from speaking our language, practicing our religion and our culture. They tried to erase it all. And in Ireland, everyone speaks English. People speak Irish, maybe, academically or, very minimally. Unkupo folkla, 2 words of Irish, maybe. And but here in Ukraine, it's amazing what you've pulled off. I mean, you've kept, despite all odds, kept the language alive. And of course, now it's been reawakened. Russia has actually reawakened especially in Russian-speaking cities like Odessa and Kharkiv, because of the regular attacks from Moscow, people are more fiercely speaking Ukrainian. And so I think Ukrainian identity probably now is stronger than it's ever been. And that's what, if we look, we got to talk about the Rus people too and some of that history. But if you look at the history of what's happening now in Ukraine, I think without Ukrainians' ability to share your stories about what's happening, without Telegram and social media to show the atrocities, I think there certainly would not be the type of support we see now for Ukraine. And it makes me realize how easy genocides have been throughout human history. Because you could just lie. If you were in power, you could You could lie about what was happening. You could cover it up and erase it. And then if you kill all the people and you kill their language, then there's no way to ever know what happened. And it seems like that was the method for centuries. But now, and I think even as we look at the leaders in the West, everyone was so quiet the first few days of the big invasion. And I thought, we in America, people think that the White House and all that was very supportive of Ukraine, but I think a lot of people were just kind of hoping the problem would go away. Russia would roll over Ukraine and we wouldn't have to deal with this. And it's this Ukrainian, this resistance of saying, because if you lose, we will be exterminated. And if that's your mentality, then you'll do everything you can to fight. We talk about the Rus people, because if I look at the story of Russia, and in some ways, like I don't like to go too deep into the history on this, because the main history is what Russia's doing today, and it's evil and it's bad. If we go back to history, I like to go back to Maidan, and I want to do that before we finish a little bit more. But it's interesting to look at. So the Rus people came from what is now Stockholm, Sweden, right? The Sweden area. Rus means the rowers, and in fact, in the Finnish language, they call Sweden Ruotsi. So they preserved the name Rus, as that was the homeland of the Rus people. They sailed down to what is now Kyiv. So as you walk this city on the sewers, you have the Vikings, 3 brothers and a sister. Ki was one of the brothers, right?
Yeah.
From which you get
Kyiv.
And so these are the Rus people. They came down, created this great civilization in Kyiv. And then there was sort of a jealous brother or prince that fled and went to Moscow. It's kind of Shakespearean. And then he made an alliance with the Mongols. And Moscow was not even created till 200 years after St. Sophia was built here, the great Gold Dome Cathedral in Kyiv. And ever since then, it seems like it has been a story of Moscow trying to control Kyiv. Is that a fair characterization?
This was basically the essence of Moscow. Since its appeared, Moscow was basically empire. Expansion was its only policy. Going eastwards, going westwards, organizing wars, and so on and so on. I mean, this was like a problem for many Western countries, which were empires, but looks like they have refused from it a long time ago, and they have switched to normal civilized life. And I think they are paying, just enough for their past mistakes. Instead, the Russian Empire has refused to recognize its past mistakes. On the contrary, it still continues its imperialistic policies now towards Ukraine. And this is the same expansion, the same genocidal wars which is happening today, which Russia has conducted for centuries against Ukraine and many other nations. Not only actually which are beyond Russia now, but those nations which are within Russia now, because, well, basically there are many nations which have been colonized, which have been to a large extent exterminated. And even in this war, that that in percentage, Russia is sending much more representatives of indigenous people from its territory than ethnic Russians. So this is yet another way for Russia to get rid of its indigenous people, so that Russia can control much easier those regions. So yes, I agree with you. This is the nature, the essence of the Moscow Empire, to expand, to get control over more and more territories. And I think if after this war Russia remains within its current territories, within its current borders, sooner or later, like whatever happens in Russia, sooner or later we will see yet another attempt to organize aggression against its neighbors.
Which brings up the not very small project that you are working on. I should say, Taras Bik, because you were saying maybe more than a year ago, we were talking about this, that you were working on the project of the breakup of the Russian Federation.
We call it decolonization and restructuring of the Russian Federation.
Decolonization and restructuring of the Russian Federation, aka the breakup. But yeah, that's exactly the idea. When I first heard it, it sounded impossible to me. You were traveling around, meeting with people around Europe and in the U.S. To work on this, and you acknowledged that it was extremely difficult and it would take a lot of time. You work with some dissidents within Russia very quietly, and I think a lot of people, when I would mention this to people, they would laugh at it, say, "Oh, that's ridiculous," especially people in Washington. I think there's, as Henry Kissinger wrote in The Spectator in December 2022, the world needs Russia in the balance of the global equilibrium, sort of this unimaginative and perhaps fearful worldview. And you've been plodding away at this project, making alliances, and then when there was that, and I can only call it a circus. We don't really know what was going on with the Prigozhin Wagner rebellion in Moscow. And by the way, we're talking just a few hours after it seems that Prigozhin went down in a plane crash in Russia. By the time this airs, I'm sure the story, be many more details. I don't trust anything that comes out of Russia, but whatever happened with that Wagner rebellion, even if it was some kind of Kremlin orchestration, it showed profound weakness within Russia. And no one has since that time, whenever I've mentioned your project of the decolonization and restructuring of the Russian Federation, no one has laughed. I think people still might be afraid of that idea, but people see the possibility. What is the current status of this mission, and why is it necessary again to, is this necessary for Ukrainian victory, for victory of freedom, to break up Russia?
Not only for Ukrainian victory. So, yes, I have joined this project back in May 2022, when I realized that there are some people, mainly Russian citizens, who, because of their position, had to flee their country, and most of them live in Europe now. And they represent both indigenous people as well as just simply ethnic Russians who are from different regions of Russia. And they talk openly about independence of their regions because they do not want to be part of this evil empire. They want to have opportunity to develop themselves within independent states. And this is a group of people called Free Nations of Post-Russia Forum. So we have had already seven forum all over Europe. The fifth one was actually in the European Parliament, so on discussing it on quite high level. Then we had in the United States, and just recently in Japan, Tokyo. And actually the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has reacted to the latest forum, because it was held in the premises of the Parliament of Japan, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia had to react formally, with strong protest against Japan, which is actually great. And so the idea behind this forum is to demonstrate that there are Russian citizens who openly talk about sovereignty of their regions. It's not Ukrainians, it's not Americans who are talking about collapse of Russia, but real Russian citizens who are talking about they want to decolonize, they want to be independent from Moscow. Then another important point is that this should be a win-win scenario. Because yes, like many of us would like to Russia to disappear after everything Russia has done to Ukraine, but well, we cannot just make 140 million people disappear. It's not realistic, and we will have to do something with them sooner or later. And in my opinion, the only way to secure a good solution is to find win-win situation. And this actually decolonization, disintegration of the Russian Empire is the best way to find the solution, because first, it will be beneficial for Ukraine for obvious reasons. Second, it will be beneficial for the West because Russia will cease its existence as global threat, global security threat. And what is important, third, it will be beneficial for people living now on the Russian territories, because instead of paying huge taxes, huge money to sustain corrupt Putin's regime, instead of supporting his imperialistic wars, they will be able to preserve all those money within their independent states for their own development, and including by engaging with direct trade with the West. Of course, it will not happen overnight, but this is something that is possible in long-term prospect. And so finally, we are trying with these forums to convince West not to repeat mistakes of the past. When we remember that, including American leaders were coming in 1990 and saying, trying they were calling it Ukrainians not to go into suicidal nationalism.
That was George H.W. Bush, with whom I had dinner a few times. I wish I had asked these questions. He gave his famous speech in 1991, and it's appropriate we talk about this today, Ukrainian Independence Day, because he was saying, do not be independent. Nationalism is suicidal. In a speech, you know who wrote that speech?
No.
Condoleezza Rice.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Former top security advisor to Bush.
So, I mean, I understand fears of the West of chaotic Russian collapse because, yes, in this case, we can see internal wars in Russia, which can have, much global consequences. We can see, like, nuclear weapons flying all over the world, which is a very unlikely scenario, but still possible. We can see, like, millions of immigrants traveling to Europe. Yes, this could be potential consequences of the Russian collapse, but that's what we are talking about. If you are afraid of the chaotic Russian collapse, get ready for a civilized disintegration of the Russian Empire. Prepare a strategy of the Russian dissolution. I mean, yes, this is something. So what we try to do is to move those topics from toxic topics because, well, 2 years ago, nobody would even just listen. If you just try to talk to somebody to the West about Russian collapse, well, this was basically toxic. Then it moved to some marginal talks, so like just everybody ignored you. And we are still trying to move those topics to mainstream talks. And I think we are partly successful. At least, we are calling the West to consider such scenario and to prepare for such scenario. And I'm quite sure that, because it will not be the West who will make Russia collapse. I mean, Russia is a failed state. It will collapse sooner or later. But our message is that the West should be ready for this collapse.
When you use those words, Russia is a failed state, I think Russia has slathered Ukraine with this propaganda, the label corrupt. No nation that was corrupt means dying and decaying, and no nation that was corrupt could have survived everything that Ukraine has survived, especially now these past 18 months. But Russia is the epitome of corruption. But when I speak with friends or people in Washington and others about this, the only reaction they have is, "But Putin has nukes." So what's your response? How can you tread into this territory, unafraid of the madman in the Kremlin, and people called that George H.W. Bush speech the Chicken Kyiv speech because they say he was being a chicken and afraid. Ukrainians are not chickens, but how can you tell the world, what is your response? And people say, well, we can't even try to work for the dissolution of Russia because Putin will go nuclear.
Can we feel safe with the person who destroyed Kakhovka Dam? Can we feel safe that he controls nuclear weapon? I mean, what can be worse? I mean, we are now already in the worst possible situation. On the other hand, if we have some potential for new independent states, actually it's time for Western representatives to talk to potential leaders of the Western states. Like, listen, guys, you give up your nuclear weapons, we just help you to develop. Well, basically what happened in Ukraine. Yes, Budapest guarantees did not work properly as we expected them, but still the West is standing on our side strongly and helping us to defend. The same scenario can be used for many other countries which are now controlled which are now part of the Russian Federation. Making a deal with them that they give up nukes, they give up their authoritarian policies. Instead, the West helps them to become democratic and even engages them in economic and trade relations. This could be part of the solution to nuclear weapons problem.
Do you need bottom-up Maidan movements in those countries? I mean, do you see the possibility of, or are people so broken after centuries of living under czars and Putins and Stalins that did you see any kind of Ukrainian spirit in any of these far-flung Russian republics?
No, you cannot compare Ukrainian spirit to any place in Russia. Yeah. But still, I mean, within this forum, we are meeting people, Russian citizens, including actually quite recently many young generation, representatives of young generation who are trying to create these movements. They were not representatives of some elites back there. I mean, like political so-called elites. They are just representatives of different movements, actually from environmental movements to some diaspora movements who are trying to unite people around them. So I think there are some first steps of these bottom-up approach movements, and which will sooner or later lead to some kind of Maidan on those territories.
And Taras, one thing I like about your story is that you're not only working at the very theoretical, long-term, high-level approach, but also especially since the Maidan in 2014, you've been working at a very practical micro level. And so, for example, we went on the road trip with several friends to Odessa and Mykolaiv, and you introduced me to the mayor of Mykolaiv with whom you've worked. I remember we were standing, Mykolaiv is a place that back then, because it was right before the liberation of Kherson, and so there was...
2 days, I think, before the liberation.
It was 2 days, and we could hear the sounds of the liberation in effect. And Mykolaiv is a place that back then could be shelled at any moment. and we're standing there in the parking lot, and then there's this car, maybe a Honda or something, just comes drifting into the parking lot, literally drifting. And I said, oh, well, we're waiting to meet the mayor. I said, well, what is that guy doing? And you said, oh, that's the mayor of the city, Alexei Sienkiewicz. And as we were having that conversation, you had worked with him. He came from the generation of Maidan. And I saw in those meetings in Mykolaiv just how deep the Russian corruption had been, in the level of the local government. And when I look at the frustration in America with government, it extends to every level. People just feel that they don't have agency, whether it's, small bureaucratic things they have to deal with, or, not able, just can't find an opportunity in life. This is such a heaviness in America now. Here, Ukrainians have agency, but you have to fight for it. And even at that local level, as I saw in Mykolaiv, I mean, the mayor was, he was elected by the people, and then they kicked him out of office, right? Was he put in jail? Just can you briefly say what? Because in that micro story, it shows what it takes to fight the corruption, what it took before the big invasion, and then when he got back into it, that means it's all clear in Kharkiv, by the way. When he got back into he came back into office right before the full-scale invasion, and he kept the Russians out of the city, whereas not far away in the city of Kherson, you had pro-Russian politicians, and that city fell very quickly. So, can you just describe a little bit about what you were doing in Mykolaiv?
Yes, Mykolaiv is actually a great example of what is happening in Ukraine. Mykolaiv used to be one of the most pro-Russian and pro-Soviet cities. So we have conducted many opinion polls there, and it was like really pro-Russian, pro-Soviet, and always controlled by some criminal pro-Russian mayor. After the Revolution of Dignity, in quite a surprise elections, local leader of head of like IT company, young pro-European guy from pro-European party named Alexander Sienkiewicz won the elections, and it was like quite shocking. But since he did not have majority in the city council, he had to establish coalition with like the bad guys, like pro-Russian guys. So of course, this is like one of the key rules in politics: never go for compromises with evil. Well, since he was not experienced politician, he had to go to those compromises, and ultimately, basically, his partners removed him, opened some criminal, like those of just fake cases, and accusing him in corruption. And they removed him from office. And surprisingly, there were just, even the mayor said he was surprised by how many people went to the street to defend him, like ordinary people who basically elected him. And so basically he managed to fight back in the court. He won the case and he returned to office. And then he was re-elected. He got much more representatives of his party in the city council. And since that time, he was trying to do something positive for the city. And in 2022, well, Russians were basically on the outskirts of the city. And the interesting story that many representatives of security services, police basically fled the city because, well, it was the chances the city would fall were really high. However, it was thanks to ordinary people like Mayor Sienkiewicz and municipality officials who had nothing to do with military, who got united, and they were helping Ukrainian army to defend the city. Not only mayor's office, governor's office, you probably have seen very famous Governor Kim. So all of them, just civilian people, they had to take rifles, they had to risk their lives to help the army to defend the city. And the city was surrounded for quite a while, like semi-surrounded. However, they managed to fight back, but still the city has paid a really huge price because Russian artillery was standing for 8 months quite closely to Mykolaiv, and the city was under constant bombardment. And so even before the liberation of the Kherson region, so even when the city was under bombardment, we started working with the city already. And at that point, Kingdom of Denmark has decided to take under auspices recovery of Mykolaiv. And I remember at one of the first meetings, there was a very good message from the mayor who said at the meeting with the ambassador of Denmark, he said, like, listen, we do not need money. The less money I have coming, in my city, the less seduction from my officials, the better for me. We need projects and we need their results. So we started working in this area, and we managed to organize many projects on restoring water supply system, on providing construction materials, heating heating system, electricity, and so on and so on. And this has become a really successful cooperation. Basically, on the example of Mykolaiv, we can demonstrate two cases. First, how successful decentralization or reform was. Because since 2014, after decentralization reform had been implemented, the trust towards local governance was growing like immensely. And I think this has played a huge role because local self-governance was becoming, when the Russians invaded, local self-governance in Ukraine were becoming one of those, centers uniting citizens to defend their communities, to defend their cities. And so I see this as a direct result of the decentralization reform, because the mayors, if they wanted to be re-elected, instead of stealing money, they had to invest in their city, so that citizens see that cities is improving and they're re-elected. That's how it works in democracy. And second case, yes, it's about local patriotism. People were ordinary people, civilians, were becoming so patriotic of their cities that they were just joining different army formation and defending their cities. And finally, third, it's about recovery process. We need to secure as transparent, as integral recovery process as possible. And Mykolaiv example is actually one of those examples which has already been successful.
And Mykolaiv, I mean, it's an important city because it's a shipbuilding capital. I think that's why
It used to be.
It used to be. And maybe there's potential there for
Yes.
recovery.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about this decentralization, this is, I think, what Moscow and others were opposing, because you can't control things as much. You can't plunder as much when it's in the hands of the local people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that very decentralization that actually also made it not only more difficult to plunder, but impossible to take the city. Right, because so you had all these years of fighting corruption, which had actually prepared everyone to actually have to physically, literally fight to protect the city. And I think that's the story, I think, of post Maidan Ukraine and of this full scale invasion by Russia.
And I would say that quite symbolically, the very famous Russian military ship Moscow was built actually in Mykolaiv. And quite symbolically that today, basically, Mykolaiv citizens have shown the Russians the way to go, just following the famous Russian military ship.
Can you say in Ukrainian the phrase of it actually comes from Snake Island, but the Russian ship, go.
I don't think it's proper. To say it will be cut anyway. Русский военный корабль.
Thank you. Yeah. It's Independence Day. I think it's okay. Yeah. And you see that as I'm driving around Ukraine. I love to see that on people's cars. Mm-hmm. We'll put in the description what it means in English. Taras, great. And last question I want to ask is, what in these 18 months of full-scale invasion, what was the most difficult moment or day or moment, however you want to define it, but the most difficult moment for you?
I would say that there was, even though it was clear for me the war is coming. 10 days before the war, I just took my family out to Western Ukraine, and then after first missiles landed in Western Ukraine, I just sent them to Poland. And then this first several weeks, actually even several days in Kiev, when Russians were approaching, I have to admit I had this fear because nobody knows what Russians would do, where they would stop. But on the other hand, I could not have imagined what Russians would do here. I mean, I live in Kyiv for quite a while, and I have seen those freedom-loving citizens of Kyiv. Even if Russians had managed to occupy the city, Kyiv citizens would have killed them with bare hands. I mean, they would do everything to protect freedom, to protect their dignity. And, there were first 3 days when it still was not clear what was happening to the city. Then I went to local military recruitment office, so-called Voyenkomat, to territorial defense, and I was shocked to see hundreds of men lining up to join the army to defend the city. I was so positively shocked. Actually, the military recruitment office actually had the privilege to choose. So they said, okay, do you have some military experience? Do you have experience of shooting? I was like, no, I don't. So get out of here, just do some volunteering. So there were so many people trying to join the army, to join the territorial defense, that the military defense recruitment office had this privilege. And so these first days, they were scary because, basically we were getting ready for the guerrilla war in in the city, building trenches, removing all signs from the streets to disorient Russians and so on and so on. But after first several days, I have realized no, this city is not giving up, and Russians simply will not take them. And we started our day-to-day activities, military trainings, to get ready for possible invasion, but mostly helping our guys on the borders of Kiev to defend the city. And this is when I realized, no, we are not giving up the city, we are not giving up this country.
Taras, my friend, thank you. It's always great to speak with you. Perhaps, who knows where our next conversation will be, either in Lviv or, running into you somewhere in the east in Donbass.
Mykolaiv once again.
And Mykolaiv, that would be great. Mm-hmm. And I hope we can keep checking in and sharing these stories too with the public, especially with Americans, to help them believe that it's possible to have agency, and you can reform your government, and you can make your democracy something that works for the people, which Ukrainians continue to do cheerfully, even despite the constant threat of missiles from Russia. So Taras Bick, Wooden Horse Strategies, and your NGO.
Agency for Recovery and Development.
Agency for Recovery and Development. And this is Joe Lindsley, Land of the Free podcast, talking to you from here, the studios of Ukrainska Pravda, Ukrainian Truth, in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, on Ukrainian Independence Day. How do we say in Ukrainian, Happy Independence Day?
З Днем Незалежності.
З святом. Навзаєм. Дуже дякую. Joe Lindsley, UkrainianFreedomNews.com, and Ukrainska Pravda with Taras Bick. Дуже дякую.
Thank you.